Good evening. Yeah, this is better. Okay, so now you can finally hear me. This evening's lecture is entitled "Landscapes and Landscapes Where Design Meet Ecologies," and it will be presented by Piet Oudolf, who is a Dutch garden and landscape designer. He is a leading figure of what is known as the New Perennial Movement, which advocates for the creation of a wild nature and landscape, using perennial plants and grasses that are chosen for their formal and structural characteristics rather than simply their floral color. His garden designs include the High Line in Battery Park in New York City, ABN AMRO in the Netherlands, the Lurie Garden at Millennium Park in Chicago, part of the world's largest green roof, and numerous projects in England. He most recently completed the interior garden of the 2011 Serpentine Gallery Pavilion in London in collaboration with Peter Zumthor, and the gardens at Frank Gehry's Beacon Towers in New York City. Nearly 3 decades ago, he founded Future Plants, a collective of 4 nurseries that brings together all the perennials needed to complete his landscape repertoire. Future Plants has been an experimental ground, literally and figuratively, enabling him to cross-fertilize and cross-pollinate a variety of plants to create more than 70 new breeds of plants, which are then integrated into his projects. He is the author or co-author of numerous books. Earlier this year, he published a monograph released by Thames and Hudson and the Monticelli Press entitled Landscapes and Landscapes, which features over 24 realized projects. 23. Sorry, I meant to say, 23, yeah. Well, one less, sorry. The numerology, the mysticism of numerology, right? A little bit less than 2. Anyways, this is the 4th lecture in our 2011-2012 series entitled Shift, Alt, Delete, Resetting a Design Agenda, which brings together over 24, hence my 24, architects, designers, artists, curators, and politicians, theorists, to project, reflect, and share their respective design practices and perspectives. Before I hand over the podium to Pete, I'd like to remind our audience that next week we will host a lecture by the Brussels-based collective Rotor, who recently curated a large exhibition on the work of OMA entitled OMA Progress, now on display at the Barbican Gallery in London. Pete, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the Berlage and to have you share your recent work with us.
So they asked me to do it in English. My Dutch is a little bit better, but how shall we start? Putting the lights out. I was just wondering if, probably you're part of the architectural world, and I come from landscape design and garden design, so started, I think, in 1975 with our own little office of garden practice in Haarlem. So I have to move forward with. So we have to find out how it works, but I don't. There's was this the one?
Is it the arrow, Danny?
The arrow, yes.
Okay.
Just all you have to do is.
Which arrow? Doesn't matter.
What's going on? There we go.
Okay.
Yep. Thanks.
Where was the arrow? You're too quick.
Right there, it's a nice
Okay,
arrow.
good. So we started 30 years ago. We moved from Haarlem, the Netherlands, to a place called Hummelo, very, very small place in what we call the Achterhoek near Arnhem. We moved there I think more than 30 years ago, 1982, we moved there to start a nursery. And why did we start a nursery? We wanted to start a nursery just to provide ourselves with plants for our practices. So we made gardens, small gardens at that time. They were mostly private, but I had an obsession for plants. So me and my wife and my children, we moved to a place called Hummelo, where we bought this derelicted farmhouse. So instead of garden making, we started to create gardens there, and had to rebuild the house and creating the nursery and the gardens, the trial gardens. So there was no time for design left the first 5-6 years. This is how we started. So we started with, you see this little sign that says trial gardens. So we collected plants from all over Europe, from Germany, England, Denmark, just to see what was available, in the sense that plants with character. There's a lot of plants were already in the garden centers or in the trade, but not all plants were plants that I would like to see in gardens. Most plants were alpine plants, and they sold better, and they look better in the garden centers. So they grew at that time what a standard assortment, a standard variety of plants, and we had to collect plants from all over to create. And you see, most plants are tall, because I thought if you create gardens, the plants should have character and at least should have a personality. And if you want to not use shrubs and trees only, you need some background. So that is also the purpose of plants that are taller. And you want them to grow, to flower in a season that is probably not a selling season in the garden centers, but we need all seasons in gardens. This is how we started. So we created our gardens. This is how it looks at this moment. So you see, it takes time before you can really show what you're doing. This was one of our first perennial borders. The border is still there. It's almost 18 years old, and it will say that the plants we were collecting and we have to use and we use in our projects have to be really perennial. And perennial means that they have to live long, have to live longer than at least 5 years. That's what we call perennial. So there's a lot of misunderstanding about plants, that when you buy plants wherever you do that, you think that the plant will live forever. And if it dies, it is probably, you think it's your fault, or you think it is maybe a bad winter. But I think most plants that are sold in the trade, not most, but I think at least half is not perennial, is short-lived, because short-lived plants flower longer, and annual plants or biannual plants flower the whole season, and that is what people buy, because they want plants that flower all the time. But we emphasized the plants that lived longer, where flowers were probably part of the whole appearance, part of the character, but we were especially emphasizing on not only flower, but on structure and character of the plants, because that is what you need if you design. You need structure, you need form. So this is the house where we live. You see, we came into a sort of landscaping that looks more natural. Of course, it's totally designed, so we have to interfere all the time when things are not doing what we want. This is our front garden. You see, it's rather formal in a more contemporary way, but that is how we started to lure people in, because most people in garden, not only lured people in, but it was also at that time that we thought it created some background for our planting borders, but it also reminded you of a more classical garden, which it is not. But in fact, it became very well known, especially for the hedges. And everything we did was, we became very well known. But at a certain time, we had a flood in the garden. That's where 70% of all the plants were drowned in the summer. So we had to redo the garden. So we created something different. We took all the lawn out, all the turf, And we created a garden that was, except of the hedges, was existing out of just perennials and a few shrubs. This is the idea you have when you would come into the summer. It's a garden for all seasons, so we have, in spring we start with almost, no, we cut it back in February. We cut it back, then the first bulbs come up, and then the first perennial plants that come to flower very sparsely. And this is August, so that is the sort of high time of the garden, although we appreciate also plants that are in decay. So we look at plants with our eyes, so if it looks good, it doesn't matter whether they are dead or not. If they are out of flower, we don't mind as long as they fit in the context of the garden itself. So this is more an overview, a few images. You see that even a plant that flowers in June can still stand out in November because of the color and the structure. So flowers are important, of course, because it gives a certain mood, but I think the color brown also creates a certain mood as well in the seasons. Seed heads are important. They provide food for birds and they look good as well. A lot of umbellifers look good in the garden because they remind you so much of natural habitats and meadows, because that is probably where you know them from. We use them a lot. Most of them are biannual, so we let them seed around and we take them out when it's too much. So we just don't put them in when your garden is young, because they can overrule your planting, because they are very aggressive seeders. But once the garden is established, you can put them in. Plants that biennials, then they have to find their own niches to perform. And then even in the winter, you could say that we need this because normally in traditional gardening it would have been cut back, because traditionally gardening is more about decoration and about how plants look well together, and it's more or less about the flowering period. So the main period in traditional gardens is June, July, May with the roses, and after August the garden is in decline and people tend to cut it back or to put more annuals in between the plants that they are out of flowers. So this is a winter day. And we need structure and background, but here you see the garden in spring, so there's a lot of plants that flower already in May and even in April. A lot of texture of the leaves you could see in the background. Plants that just start to come up and not really in flower. So texture and leaf shape and texture is still a main thing, and that's our office. The nursery has gone. We moved out because nursery is a lot of work, and after so many years, and I have so much work, and I have to travel a lot. And my wife is not really, let's say, she's very social, but nursery is a lot of work, and you have to keep people at work and to organize your program. So it's a double job if you do your design and your nursery. And the nursery, I think it was more or less enough. We found out what we wanted for so far, and there's still things to learn and to take in. But I think a lot of things you do by intensively investigation and trialing of what you're doing. And the good thing is that we had about 1.5 hectare of gardens where we did almost all our trials and all our changes. And I think that's a big advantage, of course. If you're an architect or a landscape architect and you work in the office and you have a small garden or a garden at your parents or so, it's hard hard to find out where it's all about, because it's all about processes. It's all about what plants do, and not what they do in 1 year, what they do in the next year and the year after, and what they do after 10 years. So that is most important. So, and you see in autumn decay is part of the whole experiment. We just started, this is where the nursery was, so we started a new experiment. It's just we have a part where we planted very strong plants that we think can compete with the actual weeds or grasses that come up in a field normally. So we put down our strongest plants and see how long it will be aesthetically good to take our to learn from that and see, because maintenance is a big issue in of course in public space and public landscaping. Maintenance is a big issue and becomes a bigger issue because labor is very expensive, and there's a lot of experimenting about how can we create something very easy, keep it without maintenance, and then how long can it be good. So it would be easier if you don't maintain it for 5 years and you redo it. It would probably be cheaper than just maintain a place like this. So that is part of it. You see it looks good. This is the first year. It's very rich, but we overplanted it a little bit. It looks good, but we try to find out what will survive with. So this is in the winter. That's the boundary hedge. So that is the intro. The next one, but I need a bit of help to, because before I ruin I can escape. I know how that works. But I need to open the other program.
19 principles?
Yes. Slideshow. Yeah. Okay. So next, about planting principles. We found, of course, what I said, traditionally planting design was, and if we talk about real planting design, it was decorative. So it was just all about putting nice things together that flowered for a certain period and not thinking about of course, if you plant a tree in a shrub, you know that a tree can become 100 years old or 200 years or 50 years, that's all in. But it goes so slowly that if you plant a big tree, you know that you probably will not find out how it will be as a mature tree. And a shrub, which goes quicker, you probably will enjoy because it flowers or it grows steadily, and you can see it grow mature. But the perennial planting can look good after 1 year. It's very dynamic, but the risk is that it can grow out of your hands. So it can grow too fast, or you can use the wrong plants that compete too much, that one plant competes another plant out. So what I try to do is just to give you a little example of the complexity of the work, which is sometimes a bit underestimated. This is one of the designs. So the future of planting design I see different than just decorating your garden. I see it's more a blending of species instead of using groups. That creates an effect that probably people know from the gardens I do. They're more complex and they look more naturalistic. The consequence is that you need a bigger knowledge of plants. That's why that makes it even more difficult, that the more naturalistic, the more you go into a future of planting design, you need more experienced people, and there's a lack of experienced people. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people that work in botanical gardens that could, and they have a big understanding. But I work on projects where people are really motivated and know a lot of plants. So it is, I don't think it's a problem, it's only a mentality that has to change, and it can take a lot of years. So we need a greater knowledge of ecology, plant ecology, and a greater awareness of long-term plant performance. So what is important? Of course, the context, the local context, whether you work on an estate or a private garden or a city garden, it's all important that you know where you work. That's all about the scale. Or environmental context is, of course, important. So you have to you cannot do everything you like in every place. So this is another climate. This is a sea climate, so you already can see what will grow, what there grows, not much. As a particular habitat for just a particular number of species and plants. It's very extreme, very harsh. Or you work in a woodland situation where you cannot use the plants from the other place as well. So you have to really know where plants grow. So you have you need the understanding of the habitat of plants where they grow. So like in their natural situation. Experience is a big thing. So you need to be able to work with plants, or to work in gardens, or botanical places, or nurseries. Nurseries are maybe not the best place. I think the best is to work in practice. Nurseries or botanical gardens you can learn. The scale is important, of course. Where do we work? Do we work on hectares or acres or meters? So we worked on projects like this, or here in an island in the front of Boston, or smaller areas in parks, which are to oversee, private gardens even, but that is about scale. So you need to know where you work to create an idea of what you're going to do, because if you work in a private garden, you have to take in that your client is a family or are just private people. Well, in public, the authorities or the city is your client, and it is a different approach. So, what did I say? Durability. Yeah, so instead of sustainability, durability. So how long will your garden live? Very important. So there are plants that live forever, that live 25 years or longer. It's easy, of course it is easy. It looks easy if you work with those, because you need only a few species and you know that your garden will be there forever. It can be very boring, of course. So you have to make a little bit more out of it. I'm not going into this, because this is not on one species. There's 20 species involved, of which the majority is flowering in spring before the grasses come up. So the grasses are more the surprise at the end. Coherency, so that is the logical, very important in planting design, is the logical, orderly and consistent relationship between the plants. Sounds very complicated, but it's more that it all works for your eye. Complexity, and plantings can be complex. It's also part of your planting design, so complexity is always part of it. And seasonality, so the year-round interest, very important for your, to keep, you can imagine if you come in May and there's nothing happening, that you probably won't come back. So every time of the year you can expect, of course, in the 1st of January that when they cut back everything, then you can imagine that, but not in May or June. You want to see something. So We start with plants that flower early, or even they don't have to flower, but if the leaves or the structure or the texture is interesting enough, you can bring people back. So this is a seasonal aspect. So you see nothing, there's a lot going on, but there are only a few plants flowering, like here. But that creates enough to get the idea that the garden is flowering. So this is August. So there's a lot of flowers, and I sometimes think August is a beautiful month. Almost all plants are in flower, but you get tired of it as well, like in spring. If all the trees are in flower, it's probably best when it turns over into less. So, and then autumn is more about the grasses come up. The grasses have all kinds of color, so it feels also very dynamic, although there's hardly anything in flower. And what I say, I like plants that look good when they're dead. Or a garden that looks good even in January. So then you have at the end, when you work for a long time, then you create your own sort of signature so that people recognize your gardens, which is of course everyone wants. Takes a long time. Maintenance is a big issue, what I said, and maintenance depends on staff, and staff should be very dedicated or motivated. And I think there are enough people that like gardening, and there's enough people that work in the gardening world. But there are most of them are in a position with no responsibility. So what I think is that when you work in a place, that you should have your own responsibility, otherwise you let it go. You think, okay, next week someone else comes, so it's not my thing. And this is in Ireland. Evaluation is important when you have made something, that you come back and talk about what goes wrong and right. Then there's a sort of hierarchy in your planting. It's about trees and shrubs, perennials, the bigger perennials, the robust perennials, the low, mid and accent plants. So you have to make a division in the plants to use in your design. Then when you start with your design, you have to look around to feel that you want to be in a planting. You don't want to look upon a planting. It's not, you want to be in, because a planting is, in general, a planting to me is very emotional, you want to be connected. So you want to go in and out all the time. So that is, I think, very important. This is how I start with the planting plans. So you see, it's a lot of things. You make a list of plants, or just you have an idea first, then you make your list. And then you're busy, then you start from left to right. Very conventional, what I again said, very conventional planting design is, as we probably know, at least people that come from the plant world, that is that you make a group of plants next to another group that looks good with a different flower shape or a different color. So it's mostly traditional planting design exists out of plant groups. We call that block plantings. Like here, you could see that in all traditional parks, that if they make a perennial planting, you see these blocks. This is a planting I did. You probably can see where it is, but you see already it's more looser and it's more interacting with other plants. So the next stage is that you interact your block planting with individual taller plants or robust plants. This is the Chicago Lurie Garden, where it's a mix of block planting. It's Yeah. I can explain it, but my finger is not long enough. But this garden, you want my... But there's some parts are very... I will show you the garden later, but the garden has a few concepts, a few different planting ideas, which you probably can roughly see. What?
Je kunt het pijltje van de muis gebruiken om aan te zetten als het nodig zou zijn.
Okay, here you can see it. I can do it like this, but you can see this is a sort of a more conceptual planting. So this was one of the first moments that I started to create something that came more from an idea, where you take a series of plants, maybe 20 plants or 25, and you create a sort of meadow type of planting. It was not really worked out. I had to be at the place to set it out with the gardeners, and it worked. Then we have, this is a river of 4 different salvia, a sage, 4 different blue colors, which work as a river. And the center had to stand out in autumn, so we put in an extra percentage of autumn coloring plants. And so there's another idea of a transition area with plants that are taller than men, than in general we are, so from 150 onwards to 250 tall. So to separate the shaded area from the sunny areas. So a second, so we have the block plantings, the block plantings with the plants that are just interacting with the blocks. Then there are drifts. You see drifts. Here is a planting plan I made for Wisley, where every drift has 3 or 4 different plants in it. So every drift you see here is a combination of 3 or 4 plants that together are a good combination to look at. But also they have different seasonal aspects. So in one of these drifts, a plant could flower in June, the other plant could flower in August or later. It's or something like this. So you have 3, 4 different ideas. You take a number of plants, you put them together in a certain pattern. And you look on the drawing and you think, oh, that is graphically looks good. But because we experience plantings also always from eye height, you will never see the lines we have drawn on the paper. And sometimes we try to mingle on the edges, you see, with plants that just go from one into another group. It's a park we did in Sweden last year. So then there is planting layers. So you work with trees and shrubs and a basic layer, which we call a matrix. From out that matrix, you see this is different layers of planting we put on top of each other so that it works. So here we, for instance, we have the trees. Then we have repetition of larger groups. So it is not that every group is a different group. We repeat these larger groups and we call them a basic planting, or we call that a matrix. And in that matrix, or in those plants, we have this individual little plants that come in. That creates the spontaneity. So this is what we call a matrix, because you can read it, I can. So it evokes a situation in many natural habitats where a small number of species from the majority of the biomass, which we call the matrix, studied with a larger number of species present in a much smaller number, but which are a visually important element. If you understand it, I can. It's far. So you have a matrix, which is a basic planting. Out of that basic planting, we have individual little groups or plants that come out, and that creates the sort of naturalistic idea of the planting. So here you can see a matrix planting or a basic planting existing out of a grass, out of one grass, a carex. This is different basic groups, and you see it doesn't matter, but you can see that out of this basic planting there's little plants coming up and even plants that flower later. So it's a good way to cover ground also, so it prevents it prevents you from weeds that could come in. Here you see a sort of matrix. This is the easiest way to see. So there's one species, and out of that species we have different little things coming out. Next to that we have a sort of traditional group plantings. Sort of traditional, it's not traditional if you look at it, but next to that we have to transfer the planting design. If you have your design, how do we transfer that to the ground? So it's very logically. We make the grid on a drawing and a grid on the ground. So, and then we of course we have to calculate the plants and how many and of which. So it goes as you should do it on paper. So at the end, so list is, that's part 2. Maybe the easiest part comes now, that's the projects. But I just want to give you an idea about that planting design is not as easy as you probably had in mind. You can make it easy, of course. So the project, by the way, I got a lot of, I work myself out of the private atmosphere of gardens. So I worked since the year 2000, I think before. In 1996, I had my first public garden in Sweden, in Stockholm. And because I visited a lot of conferences and met people from cities and city planners, so I got my first public garden in 1996. Next to that, I don't show it now because it looked like a private garden, but then outside in the city. So it was probably translating my garden, my own garden, more or less into a public space. Since then, a lot has changed, and this is the garden I started in 2000 in England, in Fakenham. It's, I think, an acre. It looks bigger than it is, but 4,000 square meters. And you see, this is the pictures are taken recently, so the garden has developed. I made mistakes, more than I make now. The owners made a mistake not to maintain it well, so I had to come back 3 years ago and we redid the planting design, and I changed my ideas more or less into plants that were stronger and more performing than in the beginning. Let's say 80% of the plants that were there are still there, so this is something that is there. Some plants, so it changed in a way that it is more of what I do today. And you wouldn't say that, but this is a block planting, so if you say there's just big groups next to each other, but you see this is how you experience it. And in larger gardens, it's not a matter of numbers of plants, it's a matter of rhythm and a repetition and the size of the groups you put together. So you can create a big garden with maybe 20 or 25 species. I always say don't use less than 15, because you need to go through the seasons, you need to make the garden look well also earlier in the year. So 15 species is the minimum, but in this garden I might have used 120. And repetition, you see, is a big thing. So what I said, this is the easiest part, is just showing pictures, but and this is winter. And the use of grasses is not that I, of course, that I'm particularly fond of grasses because they are so beautiful, but they have so much structure. It's architecturally, I think it is one of the most important things to use because they stay long. Even if they don't flower, they have their character, their form. And so if garden design is about form and structure and design, then you need grasses as an element. And it is, because it's green, it blends very well, and it takes a lot of, it makes it quiet sometimes. So you see in the winter even its skeletons can do very well. Scampston Hall was another garden in 2000. It was an estate garden, so they wanted formality. So we created 6 or 7 gardens, 7 or 8, 6, 7 gardens in a walled garden, former vegetable garden, where they till then they grew Christmas trees. And even when we were building the garden, they were not throwing them away. They wanted to. They said if we work slowly, we can still sell them before Christmas. This is how it looked. This is traditional mixed border with shrubs and plants that, if you look at it on first sight, it looks good, but it is very sort of traditional. A lot of shrubs, no perennials. This is after this is the garden from inside, so not from above. So you see all the strong forms you see on the map. You don't experience when you're in the garden. Then it's just about alleys, about spaces and rooms. So we have different gardens: a meadow, a flowering meadow, perennial meadow, rivers of grass. This is already a few years ago. You can see the garden is not mature. It's not that I always come back all the time in gardens, so sometimes I have to work with pictures I have. And the gardens are much more ahead. This is Wisley. You probably saw the drifts in the colors. This is how the drifts work, which you saw on the drawing. That every drift has 3 or 4 different plants that work together. And this is January. So this was my first commission, I would say. We worked, was asked to be part of a competition in 2000. I teamed up with Gustafsson and Partners from Seattle and a theater designer, and we won the competition. This was the basic idea. You probably recognize it from the other drawing. So you see that that is the salvia of sages. That is this meadow. And then we have this transition area to a more shaded part. And in the middle, that is where we emphasized on autumn color. So the whole process. There's a landscape on the roof of a parking lot. It's a modeled landscape. You can see it. We had about 40 till 80 centimeters of soil on top of it. This was during the installation, the planting. After. That is, let's see how it's. That's in June, and you can see that how it works through it. It's all about, you can still see that it is a group planting, so it's group next to a group, but we blended more than recently. This is the meadow part in the front. on the bottom you saw on the drawing. So it's with American natives. So it's really like an American native prairie with some, only the bulbs are not native, they are alliums. You see it's a big design, not only for the planting but also for people to go through, and also in winter. That was in 2000. I was asked to do a horticultural master plan for this area, for the whole area of the battery. On the tip of Manhattan. This is how it looked like. It was annuals, and they asked me to do this promenade, which they called the Gardens of Remembrance. It was a tribute to, for the victims and family of 9/11. So we had to do it quickly. It was not really big, but it was important that it was done. The next stage was the bosque. The bosque is, you see an an area with plane trees. So with a canopy of plane trees, it's very boring, hardly anyone that would like to sit there. So we started that a year later, and this is how it looks now. Still a lot, because let's say the cover, the canopy is very shallow, and it creates a lot of light, so you can do more than you expect. You see, even close to the stems. You see the difference between stone and plants? That's in winter, so you see and I noticed that, of course there's not, it looks if there's projects everywhere, but it's not so densely, there are not so many as you think. There's most gardens or landscapes are about hard landscaping, and planting is the second thing, although it is changing a little bit. I noticed that even architects want to work with their buildings in more natural environment, take nature in more in their ideas, and this is spring. This is another estate. I was asked by a friend, a colleague, a landscape architect in England, about a traditional park, an Italian park from the 18th century. He had to recreate the Italian gardens. Tom Stewart Smith is his name, and I was asked to do the flanks here, the separate borders. So I did, and then so you see it's very robust and sort of very baroque. And then I was asked to do this landscape, which was more than 2 hectares. So we took out a lot of conifers and also the bench shell, the bandstand. And this is part of the garden, so it is partly is this is a floodplain, so it can be underwater. So we had to work with plants that could stand water for at least 24 hours or a little bit longer when it would happen. And then we had another part that was more complex. That is this part where we created a more intimate garden, tall perennials, where you could lose yourself. Very rich in flowering. But yeah, although there's a lot of flowers, you will see that the plants that are used, they after flowering, and that's what I find important all the time, that they should look good after flowering. So this is a private garden just in between. That private garden, some private people really do something with that. This is in Bonn. I don't know if the garden exists anymore, because the people have divorced and they moved. I don't think it is there, but we have the pictures. Just in time. So another small garden on the border of Denmark. So you see in a smaller garden, then it's more about private wishes of people that really wanted also, the idea was that they wanted, the brief was they wanted some clipped hedges, and they had seen our hedges, so we made it, so we gave them just hedges and perennials all together. We just can, there's a very much happening on a small space. But you see next to it on the right hand side is more grassland, which they also own. But it's a nice little garden, and the people made it themselves. They created the hedges, they planted it, so it took at least 8-9 years before I could picture it. An art project for a museum in Bielefeld. So it was a temporary project, a project for just 1 year, but still there. So we designed a garden. They were given, let's say, 150,000 euros by the state to create a garden for 1 year. So we did it in the middle of a sort of very conventional park. It took a lot of effort because when I came in, the count said, "You can do it everywhere." And I said, "No, I don't want to do it everywhere. I want to do it here," because I knew that I could spoil the park, and it was just for 1 year or 2 years. So I chose a place, and then he wanted to move it in the backyard. So he wanted to move it further away because he had made up his mind. He thought he was so used to the park as it looked like that he didn't want to do anything. But okay, this happened. It's a long story, but sometimes I start with it and I think I don't tell it all. But a lot of struggle sometimes to get it done. See, this is it, and it's still there. So because of the people that come there, it's a spa, and the people like it, so it is now forever, for as long as they. This is one of my biggest private projects in Ireland. You see, it's completely perennial. And in Ireland everything grows. So it grows 24 hours a day and 365. So your weeds grow as well. So there's a lot of, but I think they're very happy with it, and I think they have a gardener there that is there all day long, 7 days a week. So this is for Ruhr, that was for as in the 2010 Cultural City of Europe, was it? Yeah, this is the planting plan. This is from above. So we did that with Groos Max from Edinburgh. Good friend of mine, Elke Hoofman, who is a landscape architect, and I did the planting design. And this is, Rotterdam even. I think that's here. Probably you know it, or you have seen it. It was here for 1 year, and I think it is thanks to the people that invited me to do it. And and I think it's not. I had a few disappointments with big cities, Hamburg, and I can tell you a few more because after it's done, they let it go, and the people that that do the maintenance are not the mainly groups that travel from one area in the city to another area, and the people that involved me here, they made it happen that there are 2 people working on this project and on the Westerkade. Westerkade is another part, and they work there. They have the responsibility they have their own responsibility, and it looks really good. And you see the difference between a group of gardeners that go from one place to another place, and with no intention to do it well, or maybe they have the intention, but they don't have this sort of I don't know how to say, but this sort of need to work with plants. Nantucket, this was one of my most difficult projects. It's an island in the Atlantic, Atlantic Ocean, yeah. It's not big, but it's on the coast. You see, it's purely sand, acid. So I had to find out, we really had to find out, I have to be there several times to see what plants would grow there, talk with local people, local gardeners, and it is very extreme. The second year, so it can happen, and there are always plants that will grow, any place. No, the High Line, that was another. That was in 1995. I was involved and asked by field operations. They were on the short list, 5 people left from 700 and more entries. And they asked me to come and if I wanted to do the planting design, but I had never heard of the High Line, and nobody had, only the people that were involved probably. But I looked on the website, I saw the history, I saw the people that were the founders, I saw the stories, and I thought, yes, I want to do that. So that is how I got involved. This was my first visit in 1995. This is with entrance. I don't know who has been there, but this is where you come up in the beginning. This is the end of section 2. So you see people from Delius Covidio and field operations. This is, it looked really exciting, and that I can imagine that they wanted to keep the spirit of this place. But even this spirit probably of the people that lived alongside of the High Line. That was the office of field operation, and I came first. This is the whole area, so it's 1.5 miles long, which is it's very long. It's my biggest project, I think, although not concerning the square meters, but concerning the degree of difficulty on a rooftop. Sometimes we had only 14 inches of soil. Sometimes we had, but never more than 60 centimeters or 20 inches at most. And where the trees came, that they were raised containers. So the planting is mostly sometimes in 14 inches and sometimes, let's say, 30 centimeters. And if we are lucky, in 40, 50 centimeters of soil. So this is, you see, again, a few sketches of in the planting design. This is just some images of during the construction. This is when everything was excavated, before they started to rebuild. We were laying out the plants. You see the grid again. Bringing up the plants. So the architects, so you see they have brought back the rail. This is when it's just opened. So the whole, let's say, it looked if it stayed there, but it was replaced. This is the first year. And bulbs, we have bulbs involved. You see spring. So first bulbs, that is summer. And this is in autumn, so it's the same place. You see the planting changes, not only by plants but also by character. And because it's 1.5 miles long, you cannot do just one planting ID over the whole stretch. So we have areas where it's just pure woodland, and we have half open woodland, places where we have only a few shrubs here and there. We have a sort of jungle where you go to a tunnel of trees that grow very quick. This is a space where we have used 100% native American plants. So in a sort of composition that it looks if it just came up. This is a mixed area with South European grasses and European grasses and American natives. So it's a mix of cultivated plants and cultivated grasses, European grasses. This is typically a grass prairie with tall American native plants. So that's how you create different ambiances. Of course, you see the grass is always good for autumn. Also good for birds. So you see wildlife and birds. I've never seen so many birds as in gardens with grasses. And also in the battery, especially also in on the High Line, hundreds of birds. And the seeds that you leave in the plants, they are all, once they discovered it, they're gone. So you can say beautiful seed heads, but you have to be lucky and have no birds to keep them. So this is section 2, the flyover in the early stage. A complete different planting of ground covers and ferns, a sort of very green covered floor with tall trees. And this is another type of meadow we created at the back part, the second part. So you see all the images you see are different concerning plantings. So it's good when you walk that there's a surprise. Every 100 or 200 yards is a different garden. So, and then I was asked by Sana Architects in 2000 to do a garden at the Biennale, which never happened before. I think landscape architect. But a planting design for a Biennale was very rare. So they asked me, you can see this is the arsenal where it all happened. So it's a beautiful place, by the way. And when you come there, but I had no idea how to work in Italy. Because of course it's north of Italy, so I could suspect something, or I could imagine, I had an idea what could work there. This is one of the installations. This was the garden. This is how it looked with brambles and a lot of, you see, leftovers, which is really a tragedy, these brambles, because we had a landscape contractor who wanted to, we asked him to take them out, but in fact what he did, there was a lot left at the end. But it was covered well, and you couldn't see it, but it came back in the summer, so they had to put a lot of extra maintenance in to get it going. So you see plants by boat. What I noticed that the colors were not so bright in Italy. That normally this plant would color very purple and purple pink in our colder climates, and here it looked very bleached out. And the same I've noticed also in America, that maybe because of it's hotter in the summer, it bleaches out much easier. So, but we included a lot of annuals because it was just for 1 year, and it had to perform the first year already. So you see some short-lived plants or very not hardy plants like lobelia and some annuals and umbellifers. And we made a meadow of rye and dahlias. It's a combination. It's for 1 year. So it looked good. And then, because I did this, I was asked by the Serpentine Gallery to work with Peter Sumter. He wanted to make a hortus conclusus. The Serpentine Gallery asks a very well-known architect every year to make a building in Hyde Park, Kensington. A small building for 1 season. This is the building. It's a black box with a rectangular with inside a garden. You see, it's a double. It's a corridor. Before you come, you enter a wall, and then you come in a corridor, and then you come into the garden. This was the garden, also very complicated because it had to perform the moment we opened. So I got the commission in March. I had to find a grower, I had to find the right plants if they were available. They had to grow them quickly. They have to extra manure them so that when the architect came, because you know probably architects in general, when they build it's ready, and when I build I start. So I had to find a way that not to impress him but to at least satisfy him with what I did. But it worked out well. This is in autumn. But that worked out well. But it was I had no nerves till the moment I came in that morning when the plants arrived, because I didn't know how big they were and how, of course we had a planting plan, but I didn't know how, you know, the opening was 1 week after, so it was quite a sort of stressful moment to come in. But when I saw the plants I was really happy. You see, this is at a later stage, so it was already nice in July when it opened, and this is, I think, early October. Yeah. And a heavy rainfall. The photos are from Walter Herfst, good photographer. You see, this is the... But it looked more like a tea room in the summer than like a hortus conclusus, because it was full of people that were having their lunch and everything. So this is, I think, the end of the show. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. I think it was a very, very nice, lucid talk. Any questions from the audience? Come on, somebody has to have a question. Okay, good.
Yeah, I was wondering, you showed the planting plans, like the drawings, but is there a need to visualize your idea in another way for your clients? Because I can understand it's quite hard to read.
Yeah, I showed them some pictures. No, it's hard to visualize, but you know, even renderings wouldn't come closer than a real picture. So I find out what they want, and I try to find the right pictures with their ideas of what they want. So, and because I've made many gardens, I can find the right pictures to put something together. But mainly it's in pictures. But that's why it took so long before people really took me. Because you need to make an offer first, and that goes slowly. And the moment you can present what you've done, then it really you have something to show.
Yeah, in the same line, do you draw sections, or do you never draw?
No.
Okay.
No, but I work with landscape architects that if it's really come to visualization on a drawing or sections, then I have people that do that for me. Because for me, most important is to do the real drawing, and I think I'm quite busy always, so I try to work out, or work away, or take off. Give away the things that I probably where I don't have time for. That's it. I could make time, and then I can do less work. Yeah.
I've got a question. I would like to know how, when did it start that you took the nature as an example for developing your beauty, your aesthetics?
The what?
The nature, like prairies.
Yeah, that
and
was
stuff.
started when we.
And why?
Yeah, why? It's a good one. Now, the why was natural, because I found what I said, traditional gardening. The moment I found out how planting design worked, of course, there were a lot of books about planting design, there were a lot of rules about what you had to do in your garden in May, June, July, to deadhead your flowers, to cut back in autumn, to replant or to interplant in your... So there were a lot of rules that I found I didn't that didn't fit in my idea of gardens. I found it, the moment I found out how it worked, because I was obsessed by gardening and gardens and also English gardens, but it changed quite quickly when I found out how it worked. Then I wanted it more spontaneous, so I wanted to interfere with other plants into that more or less stiff idea of planting design. It was quite predictable in my ideas. When I found out, I found it too predictable, so I wanted to go ahead of that. And so we were talking about garden design a lot with some friends. And the word that came back all the time was we miss the spontaneity in what we see in garden design. And that's why we started to drop in plants here and there, just to interact with the original design. And then, because I had some friends that came from nature preservation, or were historians or ecologists, so we were talking about nature all the time, and also about plants. And then the idea grew slowly by what we did. We started to use grasses. I liked grasses, but I kept them very separate from my perennial plantings. I used them more architectural, but then suddenly I started to use them in the planting designs, very sparsely, here and there one, but then it became more, then it became 30%. So I said, okay, good planting with grasses is 30% of grasses and 70% of perennials. But nowadays it's the other way around, so it's a big development. It took maybe 25 years to go from the beginning to now. But nature always inspired me, because traveling in just places, that is, yeah. And I know the force of the strength of nature itself, the beauty of it from a distance is very powerful. And that's something you wanted to transform into the garden, into a smaller space.
I'm just curious, do you see a lot of your work that you've shown is basically, you talk a lot about aesthetics and color and kind of the different planning strategies, but I'm wondering if there's something, what your opinion is about the ecology of, let's say, a garden, or can it have a kind of ecological function, or can it perform in a way that goes beyond purely aesthetics?
Now, ecology is always a part of a sustainable planting, because if plants don't grow too well, don't grow well together, then the one competes each other out. But ecology is a very complex system, of course. So if plants grow well, you can say, okay, that they fit in our idea of the ecology of plant life, of planting system. But yeah, I know what you mean, but I think ecology is a much wider thing than just has nothing to do with only planting.
Like, for example, I mean, I'm not a landscape architect, but I understand that plants can also be used for remediation and also filtration of water, this sort of thing. But I wonder, if there was a way to, if you had ever worked on or thought about projects where the aesthetics could be combined with almost a kind of functional, infrastructural, ability of plants to work in two different modes, one from aesthetics and another from a purely kind of technical aspect.
Technical, ecological aspects, or technical aspects? You mean, yeah, because the idea that aesthetics are very important, because otherwise people don't respect it, and they throw their rubbish in, and they walk through it, cycle through it. So I think the aesthetics of a landscape are very important. But technical, all the planting design is a sort of technical, based on the knowledge of how it works technically in the ground, how plants work together. So there's a different. What I said, there's so many plants that they're plants that stay put. They don't move. They move very slowly, very strong. But there are plants that go through your garden in 1 year, and you need to know those plants to to create a place where they compete with each other in a way that they don't fight, but they compete, but in a way that they probably don't compete themselves out. Yeah, it's a bit complex because it is. The question is easy, but the answer is it's very complex because technically there's plants that what I
But
said.
maybe if we can use, sorry to interrupt, but maybe use one of the projects as an example, the housing garden in Nantucket, right? I would presume that there is maybe, since it is on the edge of the ocean, certain types of erosion and things like this. What was the sort of, is there a kind of consciousness to having to choose certain types of planting, not only to grow in the acidic soil, but that also kind of leave, create another kind, that retain the boundary of the island or the shoreline or something like this, right? That.
No, I don't think that you try to mimic the planting of the island.
No, not mimic, but I mean, but basically, let's say that there's a kind of condition of erosion. And
No, the plants, they...
And does your selection of plantings?
The selection is based on what will grow there.
Okay.
So the plants are always based on what will grow in that typical place and in that typical soil. So you can change the soil. Let's say on a rooftop or a place like the Highland, you can bring the soil in. You can make soil to perform. But in another place, you have to bring the plants in to perform in the soil. So there's a big difference technically.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I think you. Sorry to you answered.
Is that the answer?
question.
Maybe I
think-
didn't
yeah,
understand.
Yeah.
But we normally work with the soil that is there.
I was wondering, you spoke about you came from a garden design tradition and how you wanted to break away from that. But now I would say your designs are quite cool and hip and contemporary.
Yeah,
And on two levels, I wonder about that. One, how do you feel to be a part of a movement, like to hear yourself described of a perennial thing, and to be a part of these very popular projects? So I wonder how you feel to be a part of something in terms of the perception now. And then you also spoke about how you had to do private projects, and now you're able to do public ones. I wonder, as time goes on, what sort of projects do you want to do in the future? Do you want to do larger, or what do you dream of in terms of the next 10 to 20 years, what you might do in terms of work?
No, I think, no, in fact, I'm very happy that I can do what I do, and I like work in public, because you can, let's say you do work for much more people than a family. You can just connect with millions and millions of people. So, and it is good to be to live in that time, but it took 30 years to come where I am. So I'm very conscious about what I'm doing, but I'm also conscious about the process and where it came from. Maybe it's a spirit of time, when I started, that probably someone knew that it would once happen. So I feel very, I feel very much working in the time we live in, so in the context of the time. But I think that wouldn't say that my gardens will, maybe they become much wilder than you see them now, because they are not wild, they're completely designed. So you can never tell what my gardens will do to people in 20 years' time, but they do a lot now. But, maybe the next generation is working on it.
Any other questions? Okay.
My question is if you also design the perfume of the plants, or it's what you discover afterwards.
No, the scent is important, but it's part of it. It comes in, everything comes in. If you have to write palette of flowers, then there's always the scent. It could be not scent in the flowers, could be scent in there are even grasses that scent, but there can be shrubs that the leaf scents when they drop down, just before they drop down, or there are plants when they die when they start to scent. So there's so much things that if you emphasize on the scent alone, then you lose your goal. I think there's you have to think in more. And if you have it right, then most of the things are included. Of course, I know that some plants, so I sometimes use them especially for the scent, but sometimes not.
I was wondering if you keep all the plants as they are during the year, or do you deadhead them? Do you deadhead some? Do you leave them in winter, or do they decay by themselves? How do you plan the maintenance during the year?
Now, the maintenance is more manicuring. Of course, there's weeding, and there's always, gardening is about control. That is by definition. So, but we try to control it as less as possible. But I think we don't deadhead. We take, if plants fall over or flop, and it is very elegantly, we leave that. If it is on the path and it is a bit dirty, we cut it off. So there's, it's all about the eye. So it's all about what you see. Do you like it? You leave it. If you don't like it, you cut it. So, and it is. So it's all about you. When you start, you probably cut more than I do nowadays.
I'm curious if when you go to rephotograph gardens in different seasons or whatever, if you bring your pruning shears with you to give it a haircut sometimes.
Were you asking that, or?
Yeah, I'm asking that.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not doing it. I enjoy looking at plants, and in fact, there were years and years that I worked every spare minute. I was working in the garden, but now I enjoy more by looking at it than in working. I don't mind working in it, but there's.
I have a question. When you engage yourself with these different architects in a project, it is pre-planned and the garden gets embedded in the plan as such. And have you worked the other way around, as in the garden can, let's say, stimulate different sort of spatial experiences, different sort of senses? So has it worked that the garden itself, the plants itself, dictate some sort of spaces? So that when you're engaging with an architect, you can guide the architect to develop spaces as per the shrubs and as per the different species of plants?
Yeah, mostly when I'm asked by an architect, he knows where the building will be. So we talk about it probably what the best way is to experience the place. So sometimes there's other landscape architect involved. So you work in three. So the landscape architect makes the master plan on a larger scale because it's very complicated. On a smaller scale, I do it myself, but on a larger scale, I work with a landscape architect. Sometimes I work with someone I know very well, with the architect and myself. Because I see planting design, sometimes I see it also as a very separate discipline. So next to the hard landscaping, which is about the building or the hardscape, the soft landscaping is very much, can be very much on its own.
One last question.
I probably could speak out loud. Well, I'm quite curious, how did you as a Dutchman manage to get to the English world of gardening? Because the English are very, very traditional when it comes to the gardens.
Yeah, that was my focus. I was very obsessed by plants. And I traveled, what I said in the beginning, I traveled so much to England, so I learned to know most of the special growers in England. By those people, I learned to know a lot of botanists that were sent out to China and all the places. So I came there so much that we were talking a lot about only about plants, not about planting design. So and we had a nursery, so we had to bring in the plants to exchange the plants. So that is why my name was became very well known among the plants people. And then I got my first commission by a friend who lived in England, who had a big garden. And then I got a commission for the Chelsea Flower Show to do a garden for Gardens Illustrated. And that's how my name became more or less established. Some people didn't even know that I was living in the Netherlands. So I think that had to do with it. Yeah, so it is easy and not easy to say how it came, but it more or less because of the plants and the interest in plants. So they call that a plant. If you're a plantsman, then you're accepted everywhere in the plants world.
Thank you very much for a very nice talk.
Yeah.